Hi there, welcome to our Galatians Bible teaching series. We're in Galatians chapter 2. We're going to look at the confrontation that Peter and Paul had. It's always a sad thing when people get into conflict, but it's also a good thing when people know how to handle it, and when there's good that comes out of it and it's done for genuine reasons. And I think that's the case in this particular conflict. Let me read verses 11 to 15 of Galatians chapter 2. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. But the other Jews dissembled likewise also with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with the dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not according or uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles. I'll leave a reading there. 16 to 21 is still in Antioch, and it's more the confirmation of the gospel. There is probably a key verse here, which we read in verse 14, and it is Peter is being challenged that he did not walk uprightly according to the truth of the gospel. So we could look at it like this: 11 to 14, action and behaviour, what was going on in Antioch. 15 to 19, truth that is being argued and stated. And then 20 and 21, the truth is applied as Paul thinks about the actual truth and how it applies to his life. I want to think about some general principles, because confrontation is always a very difficult thing, an awkward thing. Many people don't like getting into confrontation, and that's good, really. It's good to be gentle and meek and kind, and we'll see there are verses that state that. But that does not mean that we don't actually deal with issues when they arise. Here in verse 11, Peter comes to Antioch. Now, if you read back into the book of Acts, around about Acts 11, Acts 12, Paul and Barnabas, that they're in Antioch, and they were there for a considerable period of time. We've also thought about how the Acts 15 probably fits into the earlier part of this chapter. So Peter arrives. And Paul says, as he writes to the Galatian church, and he's not doing this for any other reason but to establish the truth of the freedom and liberty the believer has, not tied into the legalities of the Old Testament law, and that salvation is not the result of keeping rules, but the result of the free grace of God, being justified by the faith of Christ, we're going to discover when we come to verse 16. Paul has courage. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like confrontation. And Paul has courage to confront Peter. In Paul's mind, truth and obedience take precedence over everything, even good relationships. Now, it can be done courteously. Think about that just in a moment or two. But sometimes relationships will seem as if they're temporarily damaged, because you have to deal with an issue that it would be wrong to ignore just to keep the peace. How you handle them is really important, which we're going to think about. But dealing with issues is equally as important, rather than just ignoring them or sweeping them under the carpet. Now, we know that this relationship would seem to have been damaged, but it wasn't permanent, because when we come to Peter writing, the one who was confronted here, he writes in 2 Peter about our beloved brother Paul and other things about him that are very complimentary. And so it's not a long-term damage. So sometimes a little blip in a relationship takes place just to make sure that things are done honourably and biblically and correctly. I want you to also notice this, that Paul withstood Peter to the face. He didn't talk about Peter behind his back. He dealt with the issue one-to-one. It was a public issue. And so we'll notice that when we come further down the chapter, it says that Paul speaks to Peter before them all. So it is one-to-one, it is personal. I think the point I'm making here is that he doesn't do it moaning about him, complaining about him, grumbling about him. He deals with it face-to-face, and he deals with it up front. But I would take it Paul's concern was for Peter as well as for the truth of the gospel. He didn't want Peter to actually fall into the trap of this wrong behaviour, for a Christian to have biased opinions about different groups of people and not to prepare to socialise with them. So Paul was really convicted that Peter was wrong. Indeed, he says here that he was to be blamed. And he knew the effect this would have on other people. In our next recording, we're going to see the effect that this action by Peter had on other people. So I want to ask you a couple of questions as I conclude this recording. Do we have convictions about the truth? Are we prepared to stand for those convictions? And can we handle people in this type of situation? 2 Corinthians 10, Paul is going to deal with a church, some of whom are very antagonistic towards him, but he's coming to them, he says in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 1, with the gentleness and meekness of Christ. So he's dealing with a tough issue, but in a gentle and a strong but caring way. Peter writes about this himself when he talks about actually giving an answer for the hope, being able to speak about why you believe what you believe. He says, do it with meekness and fear. We'll leave it there and we'll come back and pick on what happened and how are other people affected by it in the next recording. Thanks for joining me today.